Chapter 14. It looked different than he thought it would. Taller, more like an apartment building than a hospital. But then again, what did he know about hospitals? Weren't they just places people went to die? Standing at the entrance to the Halifax Rehabilitation Center on the first day of August, Reeve felt someone dance on his grave, goose flesh marching up his back and arms despite the warmth of the morning. He hoped the grave dancer was his grandfather, hoped he was dancing somewhere hot, red flames licking his toes while the soles of his feet singed and charred, then fell away from his bones in blood-blackened slivers. Something wrong? Colville asked. No. Reeve moved forward and an electronic sensor opened the door. Colville followed him inside. A man in his early 60s met them in the foyer. Hi, I'm Jim Granter. You must be Mr. Colville. We spoke on the phone. Frank, Colville said, shaking his hand. Pleased to meet you. He turned to Reeve. This is Reeve Kennedy. Jim Granter was the polar opposite of Frank Colville. Where Colville was tall and trim, Granter was short and fleshy, at least 40 pounds overweight. Where Colville's hair was thick and dark, Granter's was sparse and threaded with white. But what Granter lacked in physical stature, he more than made up for in exuberance. His voice was filled with music, and every sentence seemed to end with an exclamation point. Reeve, my boy, he said, glad to have you here. We always have room for volunteers. Yeah, Reeve mumbled. Granter took Reeve's hand and pumped it 4 or 5 times, then clapped him on the shoulder and led him toward the elevator. This young man will be fine here with me, Frank, he called over his shoulder. We'll take good care of him. He pressed the call button and the doors of one car immediately slid open. He and Reeve stepped inside. Reeve felt as if he'd just been hijacked by a sidewalk Santa on speed. He kept his face forward, tried to ignore the heat that was working itself up his neck to his face. Colville was still standing in the foyer watching him, and even from the elevator, Reeve could see a muscle twitch at the corner of his mouth. The son of a bitch was trying not to laugh. Asshole. So I'll be back around 4 to pick you up, okay? Said Colville. That's just dandy, Granter enthused. He turned to Reeve. Tons to do, my boy, tons to do. And don't you worry, we'll feed you. The elevator doors began to close. Good luck, Reeve, Colville called. Bite me, you bastard. When the elevator arrived at the 5th floor, Jim Granter was still talking, and Reeve felt like the target of a firing squad, a barrage of words instead of bullets pelting him endlessly. Granter was himself a volunteer. I'm the greeter, he said. Granter the greeter, they call me here. He'd explained that he came to the rehab at least a couple of times a week, and more often when new volunteers were expected. As they stepped off the elevator at the 5th floor, Granter was outlining for Reeve the various levels in the facility. The first floor included the X-ray department and the cafeteria. The second floor contained the physio, gym, and pool. The third floor was general recreation area, and the 4th floor housed occupational therapy and several doctors' offices. The 5th floor contained more offices and the cardiac rehab program, and the 6th floor was the musculoskeletal trauma unit, which also included beds for patients who had suffered brain injuries. The 7th floor contained beds for patients with spinal cord injuries or who'd had amputations and were coming in for prosthesis. The 8th floor, Granter said, was set aside for stroke patients. Following Granter down a long hallway, Reeve was suddenly overwhelmed by the variety of injuries the human body could sustain. His stomach lifted uneasily, and he imagined Judge Thomas somewhere laughing her head off right that moment. He suddenly wished for the opportunity to inflict an injury or two on her, bitch. Here we are, Granter exclaimed. They'd come to the office of Shelly Simpson, the recreation therapist who was in charge of coordinating volunteers. Her door was open, but Granter knocked anyway. A woman working at a desk looked up and smiled, then got up and came around with her hand extended to Reeve. So you're our newest volunteer, she said as she shook his hand. I'm Shelly. Very nice to meet you, Reeve. In her late 30s, Shelly Simpson was an attractive woman, tall and willowy with soft features and an even softer voice, but her handshake was surprisingly firm. In some weird way, she reminded Reeve of a female version of Frank Colville, but he couldn't say why. She certainly didn't seem like an asshole, at least not yet, but give her time. All any of them needed was a little time. Reeve finished shaking her hand, stood there awkwardly, unsure what to say. I've got more people to meet, so I'll just leave you in Shelly's capable hands, Granter all but shouted. You take care, Reeve, and he was off.